Hey everybody, thanks for joining me here and thanks for checking out my podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and click the notification bell for new episodes. You can also find Shine Without Shame on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You mentioned the idea of adding in to community building and community life, this idea of reflecting so that things, actions and execution and, the outcome, everything can be reflected on and then tweaked if needed so that the ship continues to sail ahead. And I appreciated you adding that piece to the community building process. And it would be helpful if everybody incorporated this idea of reflection in even in their own personal daily lives. It makes me think of accountability. May not be exactly the same idea you were talking about, but the idea of having a regular process of reflecting on, how am I doing? How did I do today? How did I do yesterday? Okay, am I improving? Does it seem like I'm, moving forward in my life and course correcting and finding ways to evolve and progress? So that's something that I've spoken about many times here, this idea of accountability, and in the context of shame, or just in the context of having a practice, having something that you do regularly that helps you recognize your growth. Sure, you focus on also where there are some issues, where you need to make some changes and where you maybe can do better, of course, but the idea also of reflecting on, oh, wow, you know what? A month ago, I was not able to do this, or I did not have that thinking. And I wasn't as clear about certain things in life. And okay, now I'm clear about this. I really appreciate the idea of clarity on whatever level and whatever aspect of life. Clarity, if somebody is looking for truth and looking to follow truth, clarity is absolutely essential. And so I just was thinking about that bigger community process of reflecting and thinking, then kind of drilling down to the individual daily life. Otherwise, I don't know how you make it through life. Well, I know how people make it through if maybe they aren't holding themselves accountable. You just hustle, you just do what you got to do and find a way to move ahead. And I'm not saying that with judgment. Maybe it sounds like I am. I'm just real talk. Just I don't know how else to say it. But, and I'm certainly not an expert on accountability, but it is something that I find I sleep better at night. Sure. I can think of times in my life when I didn't hold myself accountable. I had so much fear. And if I'd made a mistake or misstepped, but wasn't addressing it, it just sort of added up, and stayed with me. So I sleep so much better when I hold myself accountable. And I always like to offer that, for individual daily life as just something to consider for people to take that idea and incorporate it into life. But that was the thought I had after what you just shared. Kind of big picture down to the ground, very granular.
Part of what you're describing is also like moving to the other side of this conversation, which is the shine, right?
Yes.
And how do we embrace our shine? And like, to me, we can confidently and excitedly shine on our conclusions, on our new behaviors, on the things that we are doing well, right? As a byproduct of reflecting, as a byproduct of being accountable to ourselves and to our neighbor, to our family, to the people around us, to our community, we can then really feel excited and confident about our shine. Like, our beliefs and practices are beautiful. Our, a way of being is beautiful. And part of what makes it beautiful is because built in is this personal accountability, and it's this reflection, and it's this desire to refine oneself, to get better through reflection and action and engaging with each other and communication about it, right? Like, I did this thing and it's a new thing and it's like, and it's feeling really wonderful. But I'm still learning about it. Does anybody, like, and just like being able to kind of say, oh, well, like, what's the next phase? Like, what's the next cycle for me personally? Now that I've, like, engaged in this action, and like I'm reflecting about it, and then I communicate with others around me, I consult with everyone around me, and we kind of figure out what is the next way we can shine. And to me, that's just it, like, I'm watching communities really find their shine after
Hmm.
surviving lots of shame, right? And they're finding their shine. I mean, I gotta tell you, I I grew up in the South with very beautiful, loud, like, praise music, right? And like also my Caribbean background's really loud, like, like intense, um, you know, like fierce, just joy around being our authentic selves. And I'm hearing like emanations of that here, where that shine is big. And I don't think the rest of the world has really heard it very much yet, but it's coming. It's a vibration. It's a heartbeat that's coming, and it's no joke. And that's, to me, the other side of what we're talking about. It's like, like, there are so many ways in which external forces and the way that we engage with our own ego and the judgment of others that causes shame, and that is, our relationship with that. But then our ability to shine is like recognizing that we are actually free. We're liberated from any of those external forces in any real way, and that they really can't touch our shine, and our shine is not in spite of them. It's actually because of them. Thank you for giving us all those challenges that made us feel so tested, that made us have to work those muscles out, so that now we're even stronger, and now you can't mess with us, and so, to me, that's kind of the other side of it. That's where we all want to find ourselves, and also within that shine, we have to make sure that we don't become the deliverers of shame ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
There's a piece in Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, and it's phenomenal. It's, I suggest everyone in the world reading the first two chapters. They don't have to read the whole thing if you don't want to, but the first two chapters really do some really special things. And one of the things that always comes to mind is a phrase, to the extent, I'm a paraphrase, that the oppressed in getting their liberation have to make sure they don't become the oppressors themselves. So I'll repeat that: the oppressed in gaining their liberation need to not become oppressors themselves. So what ends up happening in this cycle is that when all you know about power, all you know about like what like success looks like is oppressive and colonized in its nature, then so much about what you think about in terms of solutions and what success looks like, and then how you deal with the people who were oppressors when you are in a higher position of power, all that, you have to make sure that you don't actually repeat the same cycle and become what you felt so horribly awful about. And so that's another, piece of that puzzle. But in our shine, making sure we're authentically ourselves, we're focused on, really the upliftment and not like the degradation or the reviling of any other group that may have, done someone else wrong at some point. It's really about the shine itself, right? That to me, that God moment where you could just really bask in the fact that we've triumphed, we've succeeded, we have prevailed, and in fact we're really contributing to a beautiful future. And that beautiful future means also putting away any of the dark and twisty tools that others have used against us.
Thank you for that reference and dropping that insight. It's akin to a book I read finally this past last year, because it wasn't required for me to read it in high school, Animal Farm. I connected. I know they're not,
Deep.
what's that?
I said deep. Yeah.
Yes, I didn't know the premise of or I didn't know the message of Animal Farm. I just knew it was about animals on a farm trying to like get organized. That's as much as I knew before I started. And then as I was reading, because I didn't look into his. I didn't look at the history of the author before I read it. I read all of that after the fact, and I was like, this is layered. Oh, I see. And what you're saying about this idea of gaining power, not having quote unquote power, gaining power, and then abusing it, like that being a slippery slope or potential pitfall. It makes me think of this idea that I keep exploring here because I think that it's at the root of so many of our troubles in the world. The idea of what is behind people, and maybe even particularly men, because historically they've held a certain kind of power in the world. What is at the root of not wanting to let go of that power, or not being able to imagine how life can still be good for them, for everybody, for all of us, even when you let go of power and or share the power. And I'm curious what you think about this, because what I've been learning about the idea of fear, I've been exploring more recently that the opposite of love is really fear, not hate. It's a fear of
Mm.
losing some kind of power, or the fear of losing some this idea of relevance or importance or status. And so to me, that is an interesting, I think, an important thing to explore. And I know many have already started exploring and have been exploring for a long time, I'm sure. But it seems to be so much the kernel of our troubles. I don't mean uh to be super reductive. I'm trying to have it be a clear idea. So this idea that if I let go of my power, then I'm not, or if I just shift, how I interact with this power and who else I welcome to the table, that somehow that takes away from my opportunities or from my shine. I don't think that there's truth in that, but I wonder if we can, in this conversation, maybe break that down a little bit more or offer some insights that could help all kinds of
Mm.
people think about this, be aware that this could be a potential issue that is really at the heart of so many of our troubles, as I've been saying, but also start to explore maybe here what can it look what does it look like when other people get to come to the table and share in that power? Does it really mean that you lose all of your wealth and all of your opportunity and your status? I don't think so, but I believe wholeheartedly that some people, and maybe some men in particular, really do sincerely think that's the truth. What do you think?
So you're like, okay, well, let's have an 8 hour conversation. And just kidding. But
I know
but
there's so
seriously,
much.
absolutely. No, but it's rich. So where I'm coming from, honestly, thinking about power and these dynamics is that, like, the what comes to mind is the concept of, privilege, and beneficiaries of privilege, when they have had access to power and resources for, their whole lives, or for enough of amount of time that they're acclimated to it, any form of sharing or any shift or transition that, feels like even a little bit less, feels like oppression, right? If you've had permission to, spend unlimitedly for, decades to do A, B, and C things that are just, maybe important to you, but for others might be a frivolous thing. And suddenly your budget gets cut by half, right? To support something good, it still feels oppressive to that person, right? And I think it's important to, like, keep that in mind. It's not an excuse for change not happening. That's, but it's one of those things that, like, any adjustment
Mm.
that anyone has privilege, in that level of privilege that goes to less, I feel like they will experience some sort of reaction, some sort of discomfort as a result.
Mm-hmm.
That's just, kind of a basic thing. Not there's no value attached to that, because the reality is, if power has been inequitably distributed, if resources have been inequitably distributed, and we need a more equitable distribution, of those resources, of that power, of the way that we interact in these ways, like, then, it's just something that needs to kind of be approached.
Mm.
There's, but it's really more how we do that, how we go about that, than whether or not we should. That's not in question. And a lot of times when I'm talking to groups, when we're talking about power or talking about privilege, I kind of open up like, okay, so um, as a man, I have a privilege in certain spaces, right? As a male within the world, there is a degree of privilege that I experience that my sister and don't get to experience, right? I don't feel threatened in certain spaces. I usually have access to higher pay for the same type of work. There's so many different ways. There are ways in which societally my sisters experience less privilege than I do. So when I'm in a space that is, a part of my responsibility in having that privilege is, and when I'm in all male spaces, I question: does it make sense that we're making decisions with no women in the room? Did anybody notice that there were no women in the room?
Mm.
Like, asking the questions, like, who's in the room, who's at the table. People in positions of privilege need to be, like, taught to ask that question in their own head, and then to be brave enough to say it in front of everybody at the risk of discomfort, right? Because people are going to be uncomfortable when they're faced with this question that, you know, why are there no people of color in this room? Why are there no people that, like, resemble the native population that we're talking about in this room? Like, how can we make decisions about this group that we're talking about, whether it's women, anything, that when there's nobody in the room to represent and nobody in the room to inform, we're just, coming from our own informed perspective. And so, and oftentimes I'll talk to people, like, when it's in a room with folks that are from all backgrounds, I'm like, so we as Americans have a privilege economically in most spaces in the world. So, like, whenever we're talking about, like, money, we may want to ask, why aren't there people coming from less privileged spaces in this room? And I think that that's one part of the conversation that needs to happen, which is, do you even notice when the people that need to be represented aren't in the room? When the space is homogenous, that's decision making, and I'm using this power. And then from there, it's like, well, how do we start to kind of think about what makes this a little more equitable? And equity does not look like just taking a lump sum from here and then, putting into this account. It doesn't necessarily mean this, like, this one catch-all approach. And I think every country, every state, every community is going to have to, like, think about that in ways that work for them, because there are inequities kind of on all levels, and it's really just, how do we start to kind of become aware that the inequity is there, identify it in a way that's healthy, and really start to address it. But yeah, but that's ultimately the conversation I try to have a lot with, like, young people when I'm working with young people, to just start conceptualizing, what privilege do you have? Everyone has some sort of privilege. It's not limited to just, like, we think about things in terms of money and power usually, but honestly, there's so many ways that
Right.
wealth itself, the idea of wealth, is not a monetary thing. It's wealth of information, wealth of knowledge, wealth of land resources. There's so many ways wealth can be conceptualized, but typically the first thing you think about when you hear wealth, because of the way it's being used, is money. But I tried to kind of give them a little bit of a fuller context of what wealth they have at their fingertips, what privileges they have in that space, and then how do you interact in an equitable way with all the other humans that may be part of that that ecosystem, that environment.
Thank you for being willing to speak to this, because I'm always interested in finding people, and especially men, who have thoughts about this idea and this reality. And what you shared is so insightful, and I think useful for people to reflect on. And I I think that a major part of why, possibly why, there isn't always representation in the room when decisions are being made is for so many reasons. But this to me comes back to this idea of recognizing, well, what are we even doing here on the planet? And this is a big, lofty kind of concept of like our purpose and our destiny as a species, as humans. But even on our day-to-day lives, like, well, do people know? I always wonder why they're here, and why they are the way they are, like why they were created with certain gifts, certain abilities, certain strengths. And sure, I think there are people who are definitely clear about what their talents are, what their gifts are. But I think sometimes what's missing is recognizing that every human has their gifts, has their talents, has their strengths. And strengths isn't just a word to make people feel good about themselves. It's like strengths contribute to building something stronger, better. You can't do it all on your own. And 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 sure, you can do it with people who maybe look like you, who come from community or background that you come from, and that feels comfortable and safe. Sure, I understand that. But to me, it's you're missing out on more more gifts, more perspectives that could be so useful. And to what you're speaking of, specifically in terms of maybe community building or community resources, there are people in power who make decisions on behalf of others who aren't in the room. I understand that's a little bit of a different situation, but I'm also thinking, but do you not have faith in people? Come on. We really need to start to get better at recognizing the gifts and abilities and talents in others, and not just people who we might hire for jobs, but in our communities, in our in our realms of activity, recognizing that there's something valuable in them. They have something to offer, just like I have something valuable to offer. I'm speaking as the person who might be reflecting on this. So and recognizing the value and the gifts and talents of someone else does not in any way take away or diminish from your gifts and talents and abilities.
For
That
sure.
to me is where the rubber hits the road when we're thinking about that hoarding of power and resources, or just not being open to having other people welcoming other people to the table that you've been sitting at for so long, or your ancestors have been sitting at for so long. It's like, we've got to get better at accepting, or at least starting to think about, doesn't take anything away from me. It really doesn't. I can still be successful in whatever, way that might look. I can, as long as it's ethical and honest, I can be successful. I can thrive. I can be seen as valuable by my family, by my community, and also welcome others to be a part of that. And so that's a lot of like personal work, right? I mean, to me, that's where it really what it really boils down to is there's got to be like an inner transformation for someone to come to a place where they recognize that truth and reality, and then are willing to live by that. I personally have I've always had well, for many years I've had a calling, or just this attraction to helping explore this specific idea of power, letting go of power, who wins, who loses. There really are no losers as far as I'm concerned, but that, I don't know if that can happen through policy. In terms of what I'm talking about, that heart transformation, that's real work. And you can't hide behind it. You got it. You could do it. You could do that work in privacy, but it's walking the walk and talking the talk, and you can't fake that. Humans are
Truthfully.
so very perceptive. You don't need a PhD to be super perceptive. I walk around and I watch people of all kinds of backgrounds. They know when someone's lying. They know when someone's not quite giving them the straight and narrow, information. They know when someone's not being authentic. So I don't know why people think they can fool people because I think because they get away with it, maybe, but I'm talking about interpersonal interactions day in, day out, connecting with human to human. The work of being authentic, as you were talking about in your community building work, that's the hardest work of all, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe someone would see it differently than me, but anyway, thank you for reflecting on this and digging a little deeper with me on this, about this idea, and then allowing me to reflect on it. It means a lot to me, and I think about it a lot, and I look for others so that I can talk with them about it as much as I can. Probably because I do have some sort of calling to helping address it. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for engaging in these conversations, for reaching out to me and, just wanting to kind of talk through some stuff. I learn so much every time I engage in this conversation. I always try to reflect on these things, and I'm, thinking about myself on a regular basis, daily, weekly, monthly. Am I living according to what I'm saying? Or, am I an autopilot? And I'm just kind of like, making sure that what I've been doing is authentic and real as well. So I appreciate, the space to kind of engage in this, and also, a public space for people to like listen and hopefully have some of these conversations with themselves and with their families and friends. So this is great. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Is there any last words of encouragement, inspiration, insight that you want to leave people with as we wrap up?
Yeah, I think the main thing for me is like this idea of reflection. Like I just want to encourage people to like engage in that. The daily practice, the weekly practice, the monthly practice, and to really think about like where, to the extent that you can, where do your people come from? Who are the people of your land, and how can we live in like real consonance with what that reality is, with what our ancestors would want for us, and what the people, the original inhabitants of the land that you're in, how do we really honor and reflect what those values would really be about. I think that there's so much about that we take kind of lightly, and I just would encourage people to just do that kind of personal reflection about how am I living authentically with the world that's around me. um, because the world that we live in, that we grew up in, didn't necessarily nurture for us to really think what's natural here, what's really the it's what is a natural transformation of this place. So I guess what I want to leave is just for each individual, please reflect. Please think about ways in which like the harmony with those around you and the land you live on can be most respected and most upheld.
That's so beautiful. Thank you for those powerful words and for all of the insights, the experiences, the reflections that you shared, Oak. It's been no doubt rich. And the conversation, I hope, as you said, will inspire others to reflect more on these ideas in their lives and their families, communities, lives as well. And I always ask guests before they leave, if you can recommend a TV show, new or old, which one would you recommend and why?
Mm. Man, at every point in my life, it would be a different answer. Um, but I think the TV show that to me shows a really broad range of the human experience will still be The Wire. I think at this point, The Wire is a special show because it comes from the perspective and vantage point of different like kind of institutions. Like there's a few main kind of, I don't know, there's no real protagonist per se,
Mm.
but it's like there's a few main like main forces. So there's the drug trade, and then there's law enforcement, and then there's governmental organizations, and more or less those are the three main ones. But none of them are the story is not being told from that one's perspective. And so it's not like cops versus drug dealers. It's not drug dealers versus cops. It's not glorifying any one of those things. You actually see how they're all part of a larger system of corruption that we really need to think more carefully and thoughtfully about what happens in these urban environments. What happens when industry is kind of the only rule of thumb, and like whatever you can do, you should do. So I feel like that's one of those, but also there's a lot of narratives that have to do with, what happens intergenerationally, what happens when young people aren't really raised and nurtured with like any code of values, and how does that play into this larger conversation we're having. And I just think it's not like the perfect story, but I think it's a very good representation of you know like a modern landscape we live in that really requires some thought and reflection on how we might want to do it differently if we want to move forward.
So well articulated. That's the first time the wires come up on the podcast. Thank you.
For
Well,
sure.
thank you again. It's been wonderful. And I look forward to sharing our conversation.
Likewise.